and welcome to World Now with Jim Falk. Tonight, we are featuring Steve Herman and his new book, Behind the White House Curtain, a senior journalist's story covering the president and why it matters. I'm Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight, all those joining us from around the United States and around the world. WorldNow was created to bring greater understanding of thought-provoking issues facing the world today. We thank Global Santa Fe, in particular, as well as the many other World Affairs Councils across the country and other organizations for distributing WorldNow to their members and constituents. After tonight, we will resume WorldNow in the fall with many exciting events and discussions, including speakers like Max Boot and Stephen Cook. In the meantime, you can revisit tonight's conversation and the many others on YouTube. I look forward to seeing you then. And without further ado, it is my honor to turn it over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Megan. It's great to be with you. And as always, I want to express my appreciation to you and your able assistant, our production coordinator, Abby Noyes. And Steve was in Santa Fe last week at Collected Works, and I know people are really going to enjoy the program tonight. And as you mentioned, we have a full schedule coming up soon. In fact, I have a stack of books here. Got Stephen Cook's book, and the title of that is, let me get the exact title, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. And then Max Boot, as you mentioned, has a major book coming out on President Reagan. So lots happening here. But now I want to turn to Steve Herman. And Steve, I reached out to my former intern back in 2005, Ned Price, who I'm sure our viewers know is having an incredible career. He was graduated from Georgetown, then the JFK School at Harvard, was spokesperson at the CIA, which is a very different job than being spokesperson at the Department of State, where he was also. And he's now serving as a deputy to the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Let me just read what Ned wrote when I asked him just to give me a few comments about you, if I may. Steve Herman helped all of us understand the White House, including its policies, personalities, and peculiarities, during a tumultuous presidency at a consequential time. His reward for doing so was pressure and attempted intimidation from the very people he covered. Despite it all, Steve was a constant source of news and scoops to people in the United States and around the world, and we owe him a debt of gratitude. High praise from our mutually good friend, Ned Price. So Steve comes from Ohio, and he lived and worked in Asia for 28 years, and Behind the White House Curtain was published just a few weeks ago on June 4th. And since joining the VOA in 2007, he's held several key positions, including bureau chiefs in India, South Korea, and Thailand. And from these posts, he covered a lot of significant stories. Many, I'm sure that you all will remember, the Tokyo subway sarin attack, that was in 1995, the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, and then the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown in 2011. He returned to the United States, and his first position back here was as VOA senior diplomatic correspondent, where you can imagine the countries and miles he put in traveling with Secretary John Kerry. And then from Foggy Bottom, he moved to the White House. And during the Trump administration, he was VOA senior White House correspondent and later White House bureau chief. That kept him busy. And now he's VOA's chief national correspondent. And I don't know how he is able to do all this, but he even teaches journalism at the University of Richmond. Steve, again, congratulations on the book. I know our sold-out audience at Collected Works in Santa Fe loved hearing what you have to say and want to encourage people to ask questions tonight. And I like to weave your questions in throughout the conversation because your questions are better than mine. So please go ahead and include them in there. And let's get started with, we do have some students listening. How did you get started as a journalist?
I always knew, Jim, that I wanted to be in the media. I self-published a neighborhood newspaper on my street in Cincinnati when I was in the fourth grade. And then when I was going into the seventh grade in Las Vegas, my mother, who was with me for the enrollment, uh, helped me choose the one elective we were allowed to take. Back then, if you'll remember, sort of boys gravitated to shop and girls got to take home economics. And my mother thinking, well, we're not going to put them in home ec, although I would have loved to have learned how to cook. She probably thought shop was a little dangerous. I might saw off a finger or something like that. So she said to me, why don't you take journalism? You're a good writer. And my mother really never gave compliments easily. And I thought, if my mother says I'm a good writer, I must be a good writer. So from there, it was a trajectory through high school. And by the time I entered college, I was already working at several radio stations part-time. And by the time I graduated high school, I had a full-time job in a three-person radio news operation in Las Vegas.
So I'm always curious about how someone gets that big jump, the opportunity. Did you start out as a freelancer overseas?
I did that, but not at the beginning of my career. I had working my way up in local radio and television in the United States, went over to Japan for about 2 years in the early 1980s, and came back to the States, resumed working in TV news and radio, and then hooked up with the Associated Press.
Hmm.
And when I realized they weren't going to send me overseas, I quit, went back to Japan again.
And did you go on your own dime then?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then how does a freelancer work in that way?
It's a struggle. You're literally living paycheck to paycheck because it's not a paycheck. You're getting paid per story, and you're hoping that those who are you're doing stories for are going to pay you, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. It's a very tough life to be a freelancer.
I'll let you get a gulp of water if you want right now.
It's in the other room, so I
Uh-oh,
forgot to bring
uh-oh.
it
Well,
in my bag.
but
Yeah.
really, if you need to go get it, we will certainly understand. So tell us more about the origins of VOA, because some people think of it as America's propaganda unit, and I'm sure that is a characterization that you would not agree with.
Well, VOA was set up really to counter propaganda, specifically the propaganda that was coming out of Nazi Germany. And VOA was a bit of a novelty. It went on the air. The first language was German. And the announcer said, whether the news is good or bad, we're going to tell you about it. And of course, that was very different than propaganda. But it was wartime. And so, of course, there was censorship. But VOA, I like to say, there's been a struggle for its soul since the end of World War II, and there were a lot of people who thought, well, we don't really need this anymore. We won the war, and others said, well, look, we have this new adversary, the Soviet Union and the Cold War, and the Soviets were on the air with Radio Moscow, as you may remember. And so VOA got to stick around, but with some caveats, namely that it would not target Americans, it would not broadcast in or to the United States. It was a purely external broadcasting service, and that's still what it intends to be.
And prior to the internet, Americans really could not listen to VOA. I guess they could with a shortwave radio, but that'd be the only way, right?
Right. You could listen to VOA on shortwave, but if you tried to send a letter into VOA to enter one of the on-air contests or get a calendar, they would tell you, sorry, you're in the United States or you're an American, you're not eligible for this. And with the advent of the internet, of course, anybody could access and can still access the content at voanews.com. And American citizens do have a role to play in the Voice of America. You are the stakeholders. Your tax dollars are paying for this. And so these days, if someone thinks, one of our stories is off base, if anybody writes in about that, it will be taken seriously and examined.
How would you describe the position of VOA? Because I mean, nowadays with cable, we look at CNN and we say it's middle to left. MSNBC clearly is left. Fox is to the right. Is it fair to say that you attempt to be more like BBC?
Well, VOA, Jim, I like to say is perhaps the only news outlet in the world that's mandated by law to be objective. It's in our charter that was passed by Congress in the Ford administration and signed by President Gerald Ford. And VOA staff take that very, very seriously. No single administration, when they're in power, can dictate what VOA can and cannot report. I can tell you, after more than a quarter century of doing reporting for VOA, because I was a freelancer for VOA before I came on staff, no one has ever said to me, you must do this story, or you can't do this story, or you have to spin it this way, or this is too sensitive, you've got to take that out. I came from the Associated Press, as I may have mentioned, and I think a lot of reporters that if VOA were to change, and that would literally require an act of Congress, probably would not stick around.
When you look at an org chart, even with the U.S. government, where does VOA fit in? I mean, I remember, USIA and USIS. What is it now?
Right. We are under a independent agency called the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That took the place of what was called the Broadcasting Board of Governors. And USAGM has a chief executive officer who is Amanda Bennett. She was a former director of VOA and a very esteemed journalist. And there is now what is called the International Broadcasting Advisory Board, which you could say is sort of a monitor of USAGM, and it's consists of presidential appointees, and like some of these other things like the FCC, it's half Republican and half Democrat. The Secretary of State is a ex officio member of the board, meaning they do not vote. So there is that sort of oversight that goes on, but there is even a firewall between USAGM and VOA. USAGM, of course, is involved in the administrative affairs, but USAGM cannot dictate what stories VOA is going to do on a certain day, or things like that. And I can tell you, Amanda Bennett and others at USAGM take that very seriously.
I should remember, Steve, and I can't. Is it the Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy or Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy? And where does that position fit in?
Well, practically, that is the person who represents the Secretary of State at the board meetings. I've not been to the board meetings, so I can't tell you who's actually showing up, but that's what I've heard about that sort of IBAB level. But this is a common misconception that we are not part of the State Department. Some people think that we are, and that does go back. You mentioned USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, and at one point VOA was under USIA before BBG was established. This might be a bit wonkish.
No, but
there are people that are fascinated,
audience,
I guess, with federal structure. So
yeah.
we are under an independent agency, an executive branch agency, essentially.
I think you would find our audience sort of on this subject wants to get into the weeds. Got a good question coming in from Jim Ricks. And let me ask people, when you do a question, if you don't mind telling us where you're coming from, which council or organization or city. Given its original charter and success in the Cold War, Jim Ricks asks, how is VOA now working to counter disinformation?
Yeah, it's a major part of what we do. We have a unit inside VOA called Polygraph. Polygraph.info is the website, and it is working full time to specifically counter and deconstruct the disinformation and misinformation coming out of Russia, also China, Iran, and other places. And, look, the reason that we're still around is there are countries in the world that don't have a free press.
Yeah.
And there are also a number of regions in the world where the media infrastructure is very poor, not developed. So we are currently broadcasting in 48 languages, including English and learning English. And those languages change. We stopped doing Japanese, for example, which was our second language in 1942. We stopped in 1964. And sometimes we'll bring back languages if there are geopolitical developments that necessitate that.
How many people do you reach today versus, say, 10 years ago or at the height of the Cold War?
Yeah, it's been gradually increasing. It's on a weekly basis. I think the number right now for the 48 language services combined is about 335 million. And also, there's a misperception that VOA is just a shortwave broadcasting service. That is probably a tiny sliver of our distribution of content these days. VOA in many languages is aired on satellite television, on radio affiliates, including FM affiliates in some of the biggest cities in Africa. We do use some high-powered AM transmitters as well. We're on the social media platforms, depending on which language, which country, which platform is popular. That's the one that VOA will gravitate to. And of course, all the content is on the internet. And for countries where there isn't internet access, like North Korea, or where it's deliberately blocked, the Great Firewall of China, we will use alternative means to get in. We'll help people learn about what VPNs are, virtual private networks, so they can get around the Great Firewall. And North Korea is one of the few places that we still use shortwave to beam into, and we also use AM radio from transmitters in South Korea.
Tell us how VOA works in two countries, North Korea and Russia.
Yeah, well, we obviously do not have a correspondent in Pyongyang, and we no longer have a full-time correspondent in Moscow. And both of those are very challenging places to reach, as you might guess. So as I just mentioned, for North Korea, it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to be putting the content on the internet. You might be reaching an audience of one. Kim Jong-un, we know, has access to the internet, but I'm not
And
sure.
his sister.
Yes, and his sister, presumably. So that is one place where radio is still really, really important. Russia, we used to have radio affiliates in Russia. Of course, that's not possible anymore. Moscow, the foreign ministry today, just banned a further 81 foreign news agencies, broadcasters, wire services, and newspapers, in addition to a long list, which VOA has been on for a while, of course. So what we're using in conjunction with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we have a 24/7 Russian language TV service, and it runs on cable and satellite in the what I would call the Russian language diaspora, because as you know, if you go to Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, places like that, a lot of people speak Russian, and they're just being inundated with television and radio from Russia. So we're sort of the lone voice in the Russian language, giving them objective news and information. And to reach people inside Russia, they can have access to satellite television and also the internet. Russian is obviously one of our most critical language services these days.
Bill Brandon has a comment, which is a little lengthy, so I'm not going to read that, but I will read his question. He was comparing VOA and the BBC. And he asked, does VOA have the depth of bench analysts as the British do in Iran or Russia services, media around the world?
Well, BBC is a bit different than VOA because BBC has a lot of resources that are devoted to domestic television and radio. And so a lot of BBC correspondents are doing double duty. They're preparing reports for the British domestic audience and the world service as well. We do not have a domestic component. I think in total languages, we might have more languages, but obviously BBC is a fantastic broadcaster. I'm a daily listener to BBC World Radio. And I think between BBC and VOA, we pretty much have the world covered. We're slightly different in our composition. I think we're pretty darn strong in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, where BBC is very big in many of the former British colonies, of course, such as India. We do have a reporter. We have several reporters in India. We no longer have a Hindi service, though. We have Urdu, Dari, Pashto, and Bangla in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. So somebody just wrote and said, why are we talking so much about VOA? Because that's not the title of the book. So let's go ahead. Before we move more to the White House, let me bring in Mike from Charlotte. Could you give your comments, and I think it's what we've heard, a very sensitive place right now, about Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think like every other journalist in the United States, we hope that he is freed as soon as possible. This is a very intimidating and heartless tactic that is used by authoritarian regimes, not only Russia, to jail foreign journalists and basically hold them as hostages. And it does have a chilling effect, obviously, on reporting. There's also this sort of a threat we have seen from China as well. But, we really hope that he's able to rejoin his Wall Street Journal colleagues as soon as possible.
And let me just jump in and say that here in Santa Fe, I'll be with Mickey Bergman tomorrow at Collected Works. And we're also doing a 30-minute World Now with Mickey Bergman. We're recording it on July 1st, and we'll put that out to anyone who's interested. Just look at the World Affairs Council of Connecticut website, and that'll be there. And Mickey Bergman worked very closely with Bill Richardson, who successfully rescued a number of American hostages. And Mickey and his colleagues are continuing the legacy of former Governor Bill Richardson. So tune in for that. So let's get to the title of the book. And I bet Abby can show a picture of your luxurious headquarters, your luxurious office at the White House. But tell us about what up there. Yep, there it is. Pretty fancy.
So I spent nearly 5 years in this booth, which for the White House was considered luxurious. It was nicknamed double wide because you could barely get two people in there if they were of, say, normal girth. And as you can tell, there's no window to the outside world in there. When I was there, the thermostat was permanently stuck at 69 degrees Fahrenheit. We did get some flooding once in a while, moldy carpets, and sort of a velvet prison, as I called it. You were in the White House, but you were in the deep end of the old John Kennedy swimming pool.
So you served, I guess, how does someone become part of the pool? And is that rotating? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, depends whether you enjoy pool duty. It's by organization. So it's not the individual. And then so each organization is designated for radio, TV, newspapers to be a pool for a certain day. This is all decided by the White House Correspondents Association, not the White House Press Office. The White House Press Office is the one that gives the credentials to get into the White House, but as far as the pool rotations and who sits in what seats in the briefing room, that's all under the auspices of the White House Correspondents Association. So there are different types of pools. And again, this is a pool of reporters to cover on behalf of all the other media because, say, if something's happening in the Oval Office, the 200 plus accredited White House reporters probably could not fit all in the Oval Office at the same time. I wouldn't want to try that. So there are designees who represent all the others. So on the days that Voice of America was the radio pool at the White House, either me or my colleague who was in the Trump administration for the first part was Peter Heinlein, another veteran foreign correspondent, and then Patsy Widakuswara, who is now my successor as White House bureau chief. We would be suited up with a boom mic and a tape recorder and a phone to send the pool reports as quickly as possible and rush back out and upload the audio so that all the other radio networks could use it. And then there's the travel pool on Air Force One, about a dozen or so seats for journalists on the plane who would travel with the president. And you maybe pool for the flight over and then hand off, or do it for 2 or 3 days. And one day, for example, going from Andrews Air Force Base into Asia, and you wake up and it's morning in Asia and the president's well rested because he has a nice bed, private bedroom on Air Force One. We do not. So some of those days could turn into 36-hour long days as a pool reporter. And then only after you had finished your pool reporting duties could you do your unilateral reporting for your own news organization. So, it's obviously very exciting, and being a part of history from time to time, traveling on Air Force One to foreign countries and being in the room when the president is there making history with a foreign leader. But it's not very glamorous. It can be very, very tiring.
Steve, you mentioned a few things in the book about Air Force One, and we all want to know what that plane has that your typical 747 doesn't have, but you mentioned a few tidbits. Share those with us.
Well, obviously, it is a 747 and an old one now, or there's actually two of them, on steroids, so to speak. And some of that information about the maximum speed and ceiling of the plane are supposedly classified, but we do know from some past instances, I think 9/11, for example, that it can break the sound barrier. And it also has countermeasures in case someone fires a missile at Air Force One. It's supposed to be able to deter those missiles. It does not have, despite what you may have seen in the movies, an escape pod. Or if it does, it's super secret and nobody's found out about it.
How long can it, allegedly, can it stay in the air?
Well, it has the capability to be refueled in midair, but we're told that's never occurred. So I can tell you this, when we went to Asia, it was not nonstop. We would, if in one direction, we would stop in Hawaii or Alaska. In another direction, we might stop on Crete in Greece or some other, usually a U.S. military base somewhere in Europe. So it definitely doesn't have the range of that Qantas flight. I think it goes nonstop from, what is it, Sydney to San Francisco?
Well, I don't know. I was on the one of the early flights from Dallas to Brisbane, and it was supposed to be nonstop. And then, several hours into it, they said, we're going to be landing on some island to refuel. So,
because of the wind.
Because of the wind, we had a strong
right,
headwind. Yeah. One of the things that I enjoyed so much about your book, and folks, we're only going to be able to touch on one or two of these anecdotes, and it really is a reason to read the book, is there's chapters where you really trace the history on different things. And one of them is press conferences, and the other one is just the relationship that the media has had with certain presidents. And I was frankly very surprised to learn that President Trump former President Trump was someone who was quite active talking with you guys, often off the record. Tell us more about.
Well, I estimate, I don't have hard statistics on this, but I'm fairly confident that I can say, as far as minutes spent speaking to reporters on the record, Trump probably holds the record. He was very available in that regard when we would go into the Oval Office for what was normally a grip and grin, and in the old days, a handshake, and then the president wouldn't answer anything, and you're in and out of there in 60 seconds. We could be in the Oval Office or the Cabinet Room or the Roosevelt Room for up to an hour, where he would be speaking on the record and then taking questions from us. Lyndon Johnson sometimes spoke for hours to reporters on Air Force One on trips, to the point that the reporters were, I think, bored to tears, but it was all off the record. And another remarkable thing about covering Donald Trump was he would come back to the press cabin on Air Force One, and traditionally those have been off the record sessions. And then he might say some things on the record and go off the record, and then a reporter such as Steve Holland of Reuters, who I called the Trump Whisperer, would say, "Mr. President, that part that you said there about Angela Merkel, would you mind putting that on the record? Any objection to that?" And you would see this horrified look from the press secretary, and then Trump would say, "Sure, why not?" And so you could get some sort of candor that you normally would not get out of the president by persuading them to go on the record. I'm not sure that that has ever really worked with any other president. But also, of course, it was a very contentious relationship, unprecedented in many ways. The president calling the media enemy of the people, and that sort of thing. But this, in my research, I found goes all the way back to George Washington, this symbiotic but contentious relationship between the press and the president. In his second term, George Washington was being vilified by Virginia Republican newspapers as being a doddering old fool, basically senile, incompetent, a thief, and a traitor, among some of the things that appeared in print characterizing George Washington, which is probably why he decided not to run for a third term and go back to Mount Vernon and return being a farmer.
When was the first formal press conference, and also when was the first one televised?
Well, yeah, this evolved over the decades. We sort of took step by step, where I think it was probably John Kennedy was the first one, and actually was held at the State Department, believe it or not, because there were so many reporters who wanted to cover this. That would have been, I believe, the first live televised presidential news conference. And, previous presidents had basically advanced what had been tradition. Some presidents, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, used to have near daily briefings for the reporters while he was getting shaved, by his barber, and he would sort of gesticulate and causing the barber to be, very careful with, they had those straight edge razors back then, but that was all off the record. Mm-hmm. And Franklin Roosevelt was another one who would call reporters in to the Oval Office, and usually you had to say, use a phrase, was on background, basically, what we call background. Someone familiar with the president's thinking has said, and that was really the tradition. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt was famous for using the innovation of radio, the fireside chats, but he wasn't taking questions from the media and not live. So this is a fairly recent innovation where we have these live televised news conferences where reporters are standing up and asking the questions, and they are not, despite what you may have read, pre-scripted. Of course, the presidents are well briefed before news conferences. They have a pretty good idea of what reporters are going to ask, but it's not what I would call a kabuki show, like when we had a so-called news conference with the Emperor of Japan when I was based in Tokyo, and all the questions were submitted in advance. And
so there must be an art
in a democracy.
There must be an art to getting your question answered by the president.
Well, it depends on the situation. Obviously, if you're called on at a formal news conference, you can stand up and pontificate a bit. But frequently, we're talking to the president on airport tarmacs before he's boarding Marine One on the South Lawn of the White House. And what I learned with President Trump, and this is probably a good rule for any asking questions of any presidents in that environment, I would keep my questions to 7 words or less. Because especially with Trump, after he sort of figured out what you were talking about, he, it was already had an answer, regardless of how you were going to formulate the full question. So I learned to really keep it short, and that way he would not just ignore the question and walk on. He would sort of feel compelled to answer it if he heard it loudly and it was snappy and short.
And of course, I mentioned Max Boot in his book on Reagan coming out in a few weeks. And of course, Reagan was famous for what you say? I can't hear
Right.
you.
Yeah. It's very convenient to say that the helicopter noise, the rotor, the engine noise is too loud, and that's yeah. Reagan may have been the first to do that, but I think all presidents have adopted that one.
You are absolutely going to love this question, and you and listeners or you viewers, you will know why. Let me read it. This is from William Murray. With social media becoming so key for consumption of media, how has your reporting changed in recent years? Do you find the focus on social media to be a good thing, bad thing, or neutral, and just another channel? This guy, Steve Herman, is the king of social media.
Well, I've really cut back on it. I was very, very active, as you know, Jim, on Twitter for many years. I got on Twitter when I was based in India when we had the Mumbai terror attacks, and the most accurate information was coming from customers in the restaurants in those hotels that were being attacked. They were on their Blackberries, putting it all up on Twitter, and that's when I first got on Twitter. And then I was one of the only reporters who was on the ground at Fukushima when the nuclear meltdowns were occurring, and was putting out real-time information about the radiation readings, which were being, there was a crawl at the bottom of the screen in Japanese on the local TV station. As far as I know, that information was not even being disseminated back in Tokyo. So a lot of people started to follow me on Twitter at that point. And then, of course, after change of ownership at Twitter, we had a more rocky relationship. Elon Musk decided to suspend, ban a number of reporters, including myself, who had remarked about another account that was suspended called Elon Jet that would say where Elon Musk's private jet was. And Musk accused us of disseminating assassination coordinates, as he put it. And although I'm back on Twitter, I've sort of shifted to platforms where I don't really have to worry that I might be kicked off because I've upset the owner. I'm on Mastodon, which really doesn't have an owner, and I'm on Threads, which is in the Facebook family. Although the people who are running that said they are deliberately, I'm paraphrasing, but they are de-emphasizing news. They're skewing the algorithm against news. So that's a bit disappointing.
Why did they say that? What was the reason?
I don't think they want it to turn into another Twitter. They want it to be sort of a happy place, and I think resemble more their sister social media platform, Instagram. And of course, everybody is chasing TikTok these days. So yeah, that's personally, I'm disappointed by that approach to it, but there are a number of us that are persevering and posting real-time news headlines and information to Threads and Mastodon as well.
At the height, how many followers did you have, and how many do you have now?
On all platforms combined, it's about 350,000, and about a third of those are still on Twitter. But I would say, Twitter obviously is not the influential platform that it was, say, in the previous presidential election. But everybody who's anybody, I think, in the world of politics, especially, is still on Twitter. So even if you're not tweeting, if you're somebody like myself, you still got to monitor Twitter because even like U.S. Central Command is putting things first on Twitter as opposed to say their websites or sending out press releases.
Now all you need to do is just get all those followers to buy a copy of your book.
Well, even if 1% buy a copy of the book, I'd be thrilled.
So I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this viewer's name correctly, and I apologize. Dibitha Stewart, where, what are the changes in the international perspective of the United States that you saw when you were covering the White House?
Well, I think what was consistent is that people were deeply, deeply interested in what was happening and is happening in the United States and what the president of the United States is saying and doing. And depending on what people's personal, political views may be, they may be alarmed by certain things one president does and elated by something that another does. So I think that level of interest and concern about what's happening in the United States has remained consistent.
And let me correct the pronunciation. Thanks to iPhones, I just got a note, and it's David Stewart. So David, thank you for the question. We have about another 15, 16 minutes left, and I want to be sure that we have adequate time to talk about something that is not so positive, and that's what happened in the last 6 months or so of the Trump administration. I don't want this to be Trump bashing. That's not anyone's interest, but I think it's helpful for people to know what happened under the stewardship, if I can use that word loosely, of Michael Pack.
Yes, Michael Pack was a political appointee of Donald Trump, who was brought in to run the parent agency, and made no bones about it that he was going to, quote, drain the swamp at the Voice of America. That we were not, politically sufficiently loyal, I guess, in his view, because, as I pointed out, we have this charter that we are not supposed to skew our reporting in favor or against any particular administration. But there was this alleged Trump bias in their eyes, and they tried to make some changes when they finally did get in about 3.5 years into the Trump administration. And a number of us took objection to that, said we are going to follow the law. And I became a whistleblower along with some of the others at USAGM. Some of them were fired at the top level. And there was a dossier prepared on me and an attempt to try to figure out how to remove me from my position as White House
And
bureau chief.
let me interrupt
Yeah.
you just for a second on that, because in the book you talked about how even your brothers, I think 2 brothers.
No, my brother and sister had put comments about my VOA stories on my Facebook page because I would post my stories to Facebook, and they have opposing political views, so they were sort of fighting on my Facebook page, and that ended up in the dossier. And I think that just showed how thin the supposed evidence was of any particular bias, that they were, really scraping for something. And this went, we had First Amendment pro bono law firms in our corner, the Government Accountability Project to protect and represent the whistleblowers. And this ended up going to a federal judge. And then there were subsequently Office of Inspector General investigations and Office of Special Counsel that looked in all this. And to simplify it, they were saying that what was done against us was wrong, and that we were in the right to stand up for the charter of VOA. And we would do this regardless of, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican who attempted to tamper with, break through this firewall in that manner. It's not the first administration that I think has had disagreements with the way that VOA reports and being unhappy, but it was obviously a very blatant attempt to change things.
And Michael Pack was not confirmed for like 3.5 years. Was that over? Sometimes people aren't confirmed because there's another issue that is sort of muddling the water.
Yeah, we had heard that Republicans were not very enthusiastic about bringing him up for a vote in the Senate. And then there was, in that third year of the Trump administration, some, tremendous pressure put on these Republican senators to bring Mr. Pack up for a vote. So he did eventually get in, but it was much, much later than I think he and others had intended.
You may not wish to respond to this question, but are you concerned about what might occur if President Trump is reelected?
Well, I think the former president's made pretty clear what he intends to do if he gets back into the Oval Office. You may be familiar with Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. That's backed by about 100 conservative organizations. And there's a chapter in there about our parent agency, so people can go read that. Although I'm actually doing a story in the next week or so about Project 2025. And President Trump has not explicitly endorsed that blueprint, but I think one thing we can be certain of is that on a lot of things, they're not going to dilly-dally around. They have a game plan this time around, which they did not have in 2016, and they certainly will intend to make some sweeping changes. The president has a considerable amount of power through executive order. The power of the purse, of course, is in the legislative branch, but we'll see what happens. Again, regardless of which administration's in power, the journalists and the editors and managers of the Voice of America, I'm confident, are going to follow the law. They're going to adhere to the charter and object if anybody, again, tries to breach the firewall.
And when you and I talked last week in Santa Fe, you indicated that you do have, VOA does have strong congressional support.
Yeah, I was very heartened, as my colleagues were, when we had these issues in the previous administration, that generally there was bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. And VOA has enjoyed strong support for many decades. From time to time, there is criticism of some things that are going on at VOA or the parent agencies, whatever that parent agency may be at the time. And, these things are taken very seriously because our bosses can be summoned up to the Hill before a committee, just like those who run other parts of the federal government can be.
Because you are a federal employee, Foreign Service officer? Or
I am technically a Foreign Service, not under State Department, but under USAGM, because I was hired overseas. My first position was South Asia Bureau Chief based in New Delhi, and that is a Foreign Service position. We have about a half dozen foreign correspondents who are in the Foreign Service left, and a dozen other members of the Foreign Service under USAGM who are working at these transmitter sites in different countries.
Well, with about 10 minutes to go, we're suddenly getting a flurry of questions, so we'll go through some of these. From Robert Larrick, could the VOA do more to help the U.S. image around the world with more positive, holistic, balanced facts and perspectives?
Well, I think we take very, very seriously balanced reporting. Again, our job is not to have every story paint a rosy picture of what's going on in the United States. Our mission is to tell America's story to the world. And sometimes part of that story can be uncomfortable. And I know from talking to listeners and viewers over the decades around the world that they have really appreciated the candor that they have heard in VOA news stories about problems that are occurring in the United States. And they realize they can look around their own neighborhoods and see what huge problems they may face. And they know that the media in their country is muzzled from reporting about problems in their society. So to them, to hear, about the United States, warts and all, sometimes a light bulb goes off, and they realize what is the difference between an authoritarian society and a muzzled media, and what happens in a democracy with a free media, even if it happens to be funded by that government.
Um, Tracy Van Ness, you anticipated the direction I wanted to go into. Tracy says, what is your opinion of fake news? So, and what I wanted to hear your thoughts on is on AI and how easy it is to create fake news.
Right. These are things that I've been talking about in the classroom, teaching at University of Richmond, Shenandoah University, and I'm going to be doing an online class for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Johns Hopkins University in the fall on media literacy, and we will be exploring these topics. It's very, very difficult these days, unless you're a very, very savvy consumer of news, to figure out what is authenticated, what is unbiased. But I think a number of people have chosen to get their news from what pops up in their Facebook account, and the algorithm will give you more of what you're looking at. And then we get into what's called confirmation bias, where people are just attracted to news sources that reconfirm particular beliefs that we have. So in some ways, we're much more advanced than we were decades ago when there were very limited sources of mainstream media. Now there are thousands and thousands, of course. Anybody can be a journalist, put up a blog, put up a website, start a feed on social media, and say that they're a journalist. And of course, the blue check marks were being sold now on Twitter. So there's, no, that was a one way to authenticate media outlets.
And we saw that situation last week or week before with Alito and Chief Justice Roberts.
This is just happening every single day. There was an incident last week where a fake quote attributed to the Cypriot foreign minister went viral on Twitter, saying that the Cypriot fighter jets would fly side by side with the Israeli fighter jets if Hezbollah attacked Cyprus. Well, the foreign minister of Cyprus never said that, and a quick check, Google check or Wikipedia, you would have learned there are only two airplanes in the Cypriot Air National Guard, and one's a trainer and one's a transport plane.
Oh,
so people just are, unfortunately, they see something, and that quote, by the way, was reposted by a former State Department spokesperson who I reached out to by direct message and said, hey, I think this quote is fake. And she thanked me for telling her about it and took it down. But, that shouldn't be our role, is to go around and try to direct message everybody on Twitter who's, reposting fake content. Like I said, we have polygraph.info at VOA. And if an issue is serious enough, we'll do a VOA story about it.
And it also, now it just goes so quickly. Carolyn, let me just clarify. Carolyn asks, will Project 2025 presentation be an event we could attend? That's not one of our events. You can go to the Heritage Foundation and click on Project 2025 and get all the information you'd like on that. Let me see. I just saw that and it disappeared.
Yeah, that's a 1,000-page document, by the way. So,
but there's an executive summary that I
yes, so you can select different chapters.
There's been a lot of reports about Al Jazeera and its relationship with Hamas, and we just had that question up here, and I wonder what your feelings are about
Well,
Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera is basically funded by the Emir of Qatar, and in some ways, Al Jazeera covers stories that really no one else does cover, especially in the Middle East region. But it's also accused of having a particular bias that is in line with the foreign policy of Qatar. And if you ask the Israeli press office and the prime minister's office or the foreign ministry, they would have very strong statements to say about Al Jazeera. And there's also, for those who understand Arabic, there's quite a difference, I think, in some of the approach in Arabic versus the Al Jazeera English channel.
We're about to wind down, and David has another question. Steve, you make the argument that freedom of the press is a foundational American right. Have you found similar challenges to journalists about press freedom in other places you've reported?
Oh, absolutely. We're very, very fortunate to have the First Amendment in our country. This is not necessarily something that exists in the constitutions of other countries, or even if it's in there, it may not be, enforced. The Constitution is a piece of paper, so it's up to the, we have the separation of powers in our country, which have, upheld the Constitution, or judges, Supreme Court judges interpreting it over the decades and centuries. But I have worked in very restrictive reporting environments where I was at times really concerned that I could be brought into the police station or kicked out of a country. I think there's a couple countries I'm probably not allowed to go back to. And things can change very quickly when you happen to be there and there's a coup d'etat, or a minister makes a rule. This happens to Voice of America all the time, that we'll hear that a certain country has just banned VOA because it's reporting on a particularly sensitive situation happening in that country, where they have effectively muzzled the domestic media. And that's part of the role that we continue to play, and an important one at that.
Again, we have not talked that much about the wonderful chapters that you wrote about some of the history of the relationship between the presidents and the press, but you must have had a lot of fun working on this book.
I did, because I was personally very curious about the evolution of the relationship between the presidency and the press, and also my evolution as a journalist. And what I point out is, when I started out, I may have had basic journalism classes, but I had no professional experience, and tended to take the word when we were told something by a government official, and then surprise, surprise, find out that government officials weren't telling you the truth.
Right.
And so when you get to the White House, that sort of skepticism comes in handy, shall we say.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us today, and also last week in Santa Fe. Encourage people to read the book. I certainly enjoyed it, and continued success and safe travels with all of your reporting. I know you're going to the conventions as well. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you, thank you so much. We'll be sending updates on upcoming programs, and you'll be able to always go to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut's website to look into the archives. And once again, thanks to all of our presenting partners. And we're doing some shorts now, about 30 minutes long, and we just passed the one with John Mendez, who was chief of disguise at the CIA. Great fun to listen to, and what a wonderful career she's had. Wishing everybody a happy 4th, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.